Forge Gang! I am still a hard man! Let's go! I am your host, Imperator of Forge. My YouTube handle is Forge Warhammer. This is Forge Gang Radio, talking to you live from the Forge Kino Schmelter. This is going to be the Faultlines in American History number 2, case study number 2, the Colonial Experience. So, I last talked about the Native Americans, and I engaged in some aspects of Aboriginal American history, which could perhaps be considered the first major cultural fault line in the history of the United States. Case study number 2, in terms of a dialectical historical approach, would be the advent of colonialism and the impact and influence of European colonialism in the New World, in the Americas, and how it shaped in the long term the settler mentality and the settler-colonizer mindset in the New World. So, when it comes to understanding the colonial mindset or the colonial mentality, we have to go back and look a bit to the Old World, and in this case, we would need to look to Europe, to Northwestern Europe precisely, and the experiences and the interactions and the extrapolations done at the time in which the Americas were colonized and settled. The fact of the matter is that in the early days of colonialism in the Americas, the settler society merited that of the mother society, and the colonists were in fact seeds of the mother society, mother country, mother empire that was settling. This goes down to the nature and spread of empire and the influence of empire throughout history. You had the Babylonian, the Assyrian, Akkadian, Greek, Roman, and Persian empires, and every single one of these empires were built upon conquest and exploitation of the enemy population. During the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, both sides would enslave, they would exploit, and they would plunder and extract the resources of conquest. Empire is built upon conquest and extraction of resources from the province, from the conquered province, and the notion of the British Empire and what the British Empire did in the New World and what the Dutch Empire or the Spanish Empire did in the New World is no different in this regard. The Europeans of the late medieval and early modern period were going through a cataclysm of major proportions, in which they were breaking out of the Middle Ages, but at the same time holding on to medieval institutions and medieval traditions that they in turn brought over with the Renaissance into the New World. Europe was going through the humanism of the Renaissance, Italian for reawakening, the awakening of classical values and classical interests into the European mindset, which it was trying to copy and to emulate after the Romans. The Romans emulated and copied from the Greeks, and they adopted many aspects of Hellenism and extrapolated it into their Roman culture. The Europeans of the Renaissance, likewise, were copying what the Greeks and Romans had done, and some of the earlier medieval scholars, and appropriating it into their Renaissance culture. The Protestant Reformation was a breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church apparatus and from the parish model of the medieval church, and the separation into these various Protestant or protesting groups, and the interpolating philosophies and aspects of Renaissance philosophies of the era that were drawn into the Puritan movement and into Calvinism and Lutheranism and Anglicanism as they broke away from Rome and as the Protestant influence began to take shape within Europe. At the same time that the first American colonies were being settled and set up, a series of religious wars and catastrophes were taking place in Western Europe at the same time. The wars of religion in France, the wars of the Three Kingdoms in Great Britain, and the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire in Germany. And there was also a great deal of witch hunts that were taking place. There was noticeable witch hunts that were taking place, and the colonization of the New World happened lock, step, and barrel in full force at the time that this was happening in the early modern period, as the Renaissance and the Reformation began to give way into the Baroque period and the Counter-Reformation and the series of religious upheavals, as well as the rise of the scientific method and the formulas that would lead into the rationalism of the Enlightenment. The 13 American colonies that would become the United States so happened to be set up and to have their institutions put into place, copying the models of the Old World for the New, in between the period of the High Renaissance and the period of the Enlightenment. This is very important to understanding the dialectical methodology into which the United States was born into. And so I will be covering some of the colonial experience and the colonial mindset that happened. The first major Europeans, or the first major European entrepreneurs, if you would like, who actually came to really understand the importance of extracting resources out of the Americas were the Spanish. Spain had only very recently been united. The crowns of Aragon and Castile were put into a royal union, typically under Castilian dominance. Aragon and Castile, through the marriage of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, led to the union of the crowns that formed the Kingdom of Spain. And as the Spanish were kicking out the Moors, or the Moriscos, in Granada, Christopher Columbus stumbled upon quite accidentally into the New World. This had not been the first time that other people from the Old World had come to the Americas. The Norse Vikings had set up a few village hamlets and had done some interactions in Vinland. The Inuit and the Eskimo and the Nai-Sin peoples from Siberia had made the crossing over the Bering Strait into Canada and Alaska. But none of these groups, also Polynesians, had also crossed the Pacific and had made contact on the west coast. But none of these people had any important or significant impacts in terms of the overall what happened in the Americas. So the Italians and the Spanish and Portuguese, the Romance peoples of Europe, were the first to actually make a actual headway into the New World. Prior to the coming of these peoples, great Native American civilizations had thrived in the Andes and Mesoamerica. The arrival of the Spanish were a complete and total disaster for these pre-Columbian civilizations. And virtually overnight, from engagement of warfare with these Europeans on horseback and with gunpowder weapons, and with advanced systems of exchange and currency fallout, as well as the disease that were brought over from the Old World, these developed and quite sophisticated New World civilizations were wiped out. The Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayans would never thrive again as they had done in their heyday, quite unfortunately. And instead, new systems of governance, new systems of administration were introduced that were essentially carbon copies of Madrid and Lisbon, and later Amsterdam, London, and Paris, as the Europeans, beginning with the Spanish conquistadors, made headway into the Americas and began to establish colonial settlement. As fun and interesting as it would no doubt be to discuss and talk about the works and the markings of the conquistadores, I am only interested in covering what happened in the contiguous United States. So, Hernando de Soto, or Fernandez de Soto, was the first European to make headway into the United States by stepping foot in Florida. Many great and interesting explorations and expeditions were done throughout the 1500s into the United States, but virtually no long-term settlement was actually made. At the beginning of the 1600s, and a few years before the settlement of Jamestown, the Spanish set up a few settlements, or haciendas, in New Mexico. New Mexico effectively became a bastion of Spanish civilization, of Iberian civilization, with its very well-built and amazing missions, high missions, misiones, and other aspects of Iberian civilization into New Mexico. And New Mexico became the first major part of the United States to really have an actually well-established and long-term founded and administered and ruled over old world culture and administration of government. Centered in Mexico City, centered in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which stretched up into Texas, into New Mexico and Arizona and Southern California, Baja and later Alte, California. And at some point, the Spanish Empire even made claims as far afield as southern Alaska and British Columbia. But the Spanish did not, in the long term, actually make long-term settlements in most of the United States. They did set up St. Augustine, Florida, and they did set up very successful settlements and outposts in Florida in the 1500s. They did set up long-term missions and trading outposts and military forts in New Mexico. But other than this, they really did not do much of anything else. The French did set up Quebec and Montreal, and by the early 1700s had set up New Orleans, named after the Duke of Orleans, one of the major dauphin's in the French royal court. The Duke of Orleans, or the city of Orleans, is where New Orleans actually gets its name from. But aside from fur trading outposts and settlements and military forts, which began to grow and increase in the 1720s and 1730s, French settlement was quite marginal. The French tended to have more of a establishment in what is now Canada, they did make some. They did build cities and they did establish settlements in Louisiana. But in terms of New France, the main profits that came out of New France was the extraction of fur pelts and the fur trade, and the French largely left the Indians alone. Has so long as they did send Catholic missionaries, Jesuit and Augustinian missionaries to convert the natives, and in so long as they got the necessary and required fur pelts that they needed, the French never really established much of a further presence than that. But the Spanish did engage in silver mining in New Mexico. The Spanish did engage in conversion efforts with the Jesuits and Augustinian monks. But in the long term, their colonization was quite marginal. Similarly, with Sweden, or with the Swedes arrived in what is now Delaware, on the Delaware River, and they established the settlements of New Sweden, but the Swedes did not, in the long term, actually have a base of supply and a base of military conquest in the Delaware. And within not even really just more than 10 years, New Sweden was taken over by New Netherland. So the Dutch effectively conquered the Swedes, but the Swedish land burghers were allowed to retain their land, and the Dutch allowed them to retain their farms and setup. The Swedes mainly engaged in agriculture and Lutheran missionary work, Lutheran evangelization to the natives and fur trade and so forth. The Dutch did a far better and successful job when it came to colonization. They bought the land. The Dutch Republic bought land from the natives, and they established a trade outpost on Long Island, on Manhattan Island, that became New Amsterdam, and in turn would be named after the Duke of York as New York. New Netherland lasted for about 40-something years. It mainly engaged in slavery, the slave trade, fur trading, and in some business ventures and avenues and entrepreneurship. The origins of American entrepreneurial activity and business exchange was in New Netherland. That is where the first American banks and American currency exchange was actually financed and established, and its system of religious tolerance to Huguenots, Sephardic Jews, and to Germans, and to the Moravian Brothers, and even to some Puritans and Quakers that settled on Long Island, was quite an early prototype for the American separation of church and state. But New Netherland only lasted for about 40-something years before it was taken by the English. And so the long-term most enterprising and successful colonists were the English. Now, at first, the English were probably the worst when it came to settlement and colonization. They had tried to establish a colony on Roanoke Island, and it would have been very interesting to have seen what Roanoke would have looked like in the 1580s. It effectively was the first Anglo-American settlement, the first Anglo-American incorporated town, but nothing came of the venture, and it was quickly abandoned. So in 1607, Jamestown, Virginia was set up, and the English or the British were trying to copy the Spanish in trying to find gold. Their idea was to engage in gold and silver mining to extract mineral wealth out of their colony and to send it back to London to be put on the stock market for exchange. And Virginia was settled by these They were settled, Virginia and Maryland was settled by English Racusans, who were a kind of Catholic, Roman Catholic, English Catholic people, moderate Catholic, royalist English people. It was also settled through the English Civil War by Cavaliers. The English Cavaliers were supporters of King Charles II. They tended to be die-hard supporters of the king and the royalists and the Anglican Church. And this was the type of ideal settler in Virginia. A Cavalier who was very loyal to king and country, very faithful to the Anglican Church, which was the state church of Virginia, completely incorporated into the Virginia legislature. The House of Burgesses was modeled after the Westminster Parliament when it was set up, and Virginia was also the first English colony to bring over black slaves. So in 1619, Dutch and Portuguese traders brought Angolans into Virginia, and they became slaves. Now, at this early stage in the New World, most of the people that were brought over were indentured servants. Indentured servants were basically European or British indentured servants that were worked, and the majority of the enslaved labor was indentured servants. But by the 1660s, the 1670s, the majority of slave labor was done by Africans, or by enslaved Africans that were brought over from Central and West Africa. Ghana, Angola, and from Ivory to the Ivory Coast, Senegal, places like that. Mali, Senegal is where a lot of the Africans came from. And so, at the very dawn of American history, the history of the American state and the American ideal, slavery and institutionalized racism was the norm. And slavery and institutionalized racism and subservience would become the mainstay of the Southern identity and the Southern attitude. And indeed, really just overall the American mindset. As it would in South Africa, as it would in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, as it would in pretty much every other European colony. So the next major settlement was done in New England by the Puritans, who were Calvinists. They followed the teachings of Petrus Janus. Petrus Manus. Petrus Manus was a philosopher who rejected the points of Aristotelianism. Petrus Ramus thought that Aristotelian didactic idioms were simply too complexive and too idiosyncratic, and he tried to develop a more simpler dichotomy, or a more simpler and more formulative dichotomy. The Puritans of England and Wales took this and appropriated it into their Puritan teaching. The Puritans emphasized free education for all children. They emphasized the importance of universal learning and education. And when they came to Massachusetts Bay, when they came to Pilgrim's Rock, they very much set up educational centers and valued literacy and education and grammar and arithmetic and learning as a very important and very valuable thing. Very central to the Puritans' educational mindset was the Bible, and it was Scripture. And herein lies the origin of America's fondness for evangelical Christianity. While the Pilgrims and the Puritans were not themselves evangelical Arminianists, and they were not Baptists, there were some Baptists in Rhode Island, and there were Quakers in Pennsylvania, but the Puritans were Calvinists, and they valued a Calvinistic mindset. And so the influence of John Calvin from the very beginning was very influential with the English and the Dutch, and later the Scots that came to the New World. And the engaging activity in regards to a thorough study of the Bible, the Old and New Testament, and the reading of the scriptures that were held in church every day. And the Puritans were very watchful. They were extremely hardworking and were very frugal. They tended to scoff at sex and immoral practices, which is why there is a lot of witch hunts. If you remember, I was talking earlier about the witch hunts in Europe. The Puritans and some of the other colonists were very much bewildered by witchcraft and sorcery, and they considered almost any kind of eccentric person to be a witch, to be a wizard or a magician, and they would have these witch trials where they would accuse these people of being in a pact with the devil, of being in communion and in a pact with Satan, and having broken their covenantal obligations to the community and to the church, and they would be burned at the stake. These people, usually women, probably about 2/3 of the victims of these witch hunts were women. They would be tortured and they would be essayed. And it was a very horrible, brutal thing. The Calvinists were a covenantal people. They believed that they had made a personal pact and covenant with God, and they basically led a large theocracy that went after Quakers and Baptists and Arminians in New England, and like Quakers did not do very good in the Puritan society, so the Quakers eventually fled. The Baptists eventually set up or helped to set up Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, and within a few generations, very successful yeoman farming communities had been set up all across the seaboard, the eastern seaboard of America, and this basically became the bedrock of the 13 colonies. So, in the north, you have the Puritans and the Calvinists and the New Englanders, the Calvinists and the Puritans and that like. The Puritans had been the supporters of Parliament in the English Civil War, the War of the Three Kingdoms. They had been supporters of Oliver Cromwell, and when they came to Massachusetts, they tended to model their society around the framework of the Roundheads and the parliamentarians, and they despised monarchy. Very early on, the Quakers and the Puritans and the Baptists, the Anabaptists, and these various other groups tended to reject the institution of monarchy. As far as they were concerned, England was corrupt. England was immoral and corrupt, and the old world was in a fallen state of sin, original sin, and they were going to create a new model Protestant society in the New World where all of those ills and intrepidations would be removed. They would be basically removed and would be vacillated against and basically kind of driven out of their model society. So colonial society was very based on a high church Protestant New World model mindset, are kind of a modeling utopian mindset of a chapel or a church on a high hill. The Puritans engaged in regular prayer works, in regular prayers or praying, and they built these kind of community houses where they would go to vote. They would talk about, they would go to their town meeting halls, and New England still has this town meeting hall stuff that they do, where common everyday people will go into the town meeting houses and they will engage in like talks and topics of civic matters and election and voting and stuff like that. So it had an egalitarian aspect, but it was still a religious theocracy. So the main takeaway I would say about the 17th century is a theocracy, a Calvinistic theocracy that is based on a covenant of grace, an economy of graces, and this covenantal mindset that was typical in post-Reformed Orthodoxy, Protestant scholasticism, and post-Reformed Orthodoxy, and this kind of mindset that focused more on the Lord's decretals, and the Lord's workings instead of on his personal life and teachings, which became more common later. So the next group were the Ulster Scots. These were lowland Scots who settled or bought land in Ulster in what is now Northern Ireland. They bought land in the province of Ulster, and they were Presbyterians, and they believed that they were in a covenant with God. There was the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Covenantal League, League and Covenant, which basically enshrined the Statement of Faith and the Catechism of the Scottish Presbyterian Church. And in the 1700s, these Ulster Scots, or Scots-Irish, were brought over by the Quakers in Pennsylvania and by some of the Cavaliers in the Carolinas and Georgia into the Appalachian Low Country, and they became some of the early pioneering frontiersmen, and a lot of them were basically the backbone of the Continental Army. A lot of George Washington's Continental Army recruits came from the West Country. They came from the Appalachian Low Country and from the West Country and the developing frontier, and they would volunteer and fight in the Continental Army. And a lot of Presbyterian ministers were also eager signers of the Declaration of Independence. And very early on, Presbyterians advocated for independence and separation away from Great Britain. So that's some backdrop of the Scotch-Irish. Another group of colonists were the Carolina gentrymen, or the Carolinian gentry. They came from the West Country of England, and they actually settled in the Bahamas. They settled Jamaica, the Bahamas, Barbados, and they set up a gentry-guided slave caste society where they would import blacks, import African slaves, and they created the backbone of the future cash crop Southern economy, or the cash cropping Southern economy in the West Indies. And then a lot of these people, whenever they ran out of land to build plantations and to engage in Barbadian slave labor, they moved to the Carolinas. They moved to Georgia, to North, South Carolina, and to Georgia. And this is actually how North and South Carolina and later Georgia was settled. They were settled by people from the West Indies who had already established a long-term plantation cash crop system. They didn't really have any kind of religious convictions or nothing. They had primarily built up a cash crop system. They saw the rather warm and subtropical climate of the Carolinas, and they would go and set up their plantations, their towns, and their churches in the Carolinas. And so the Carolinas were set up like that, as was the state of Georgia. And so I'm giving you a breakdown, just kind of a bit of a breakdown of how the 13 colonies were set up. Pennsylvania and Georgia were initially set up as debtor colonies, but with Pennsylvania, William Penn was a Quaker, and his father had fought a war against the Dutch or against Holland for the king, and he died, and the king owed him a debt, and so his son, William Penn, bought up some land called Penn's Woods, and the king granted that to him, and it was titled Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania was filled in by these religious refugees called the Quakers. The Quakers believed that there is an inner light in all of us, and they did not necessarily believe that the Bible or the Scripture was the means of God's revelation, but instead God's revelation was done through an act of personal self-discovery and fulfillment. And so they would actually call their religious meeting halls programming halls. And so they were very much persecuted in Britain. And so they went in 1682 and set up the province of Pennsylvania. And the Quakers went and set up Philadelphia. Philadelphia is Greek for brotherly love. And so that's how Pennsylvania was set up. German Mennonites and the Amish from Switzerland also sought religious haven, as did the Moravian brothers who went into Pennsylvania. And so Pennsylvania became a very religiously tolerant commonwealth in which Roman Catholics, Quakers, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists, Baptists, and the Moravian brothers, the Mennonites, the Amish, and Jews, and every other kind of religious minority were accepted. And there was an early separation of church and state in Pennsylvania. So this is just my basic breakdown of the 13 colonies and how they came to be. So right away, from the very beginning, there was warfare with the Indians. You have the Pequot Wars, and King Philip's War. There was wars with the Shawnee, wars with the Muskegans, and wars with the Niagara, and just all these different, from Maine down to Georgia, an entire clash of wars with Native Americans. But because the white settlers had better weapons, better immunity to disease, and much better organization and administrative and military tactics, they pretty much unilaterally won out. And then you have the Scotch-Irish going out and settling deep into Appalachia, going into Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana and the like, and Illinois, and you have these intrepid entrepreneurs. America, very early on, was already quite an entrepreneurial society. And the main takeaway, the main dialectic that I would say in this period was a rejection of old world model society. The rejection of old world feudalism, of kingly rule, of unilateral parliamentarian rule, and just overall monarchy and feudalism. A rejection of the feudal system, a rejection of the monarchy, and this kind of capitalistic and entrepreneurial mindset of trying to get rich as quick as possible, usually through agriculture and through land ownership and through the plantation system, which became very wealth-centered. For the longest amount of time, the plantations in both the South and the North were very income generating, first through indentured servants and later through slaves. And I think that one of the things that is downplayed is the importance of the influence of indentured servitude on the American mindset. Over two-thirds of all the white colonists who came to the future United States did so as indentured servants. They had either committed a paltry crime and they were forced into expulsion or to immigration from Great Britain, or they were forced to buy an indenture and someone would pay for their journey across the Atlantic, and in return, for 7 or 10 years, they would pay out their indenture by doing hard labor and work for the master or for their indenture, who would in turn pay off their indenture, and that's the term indentured servant. I think that this plebeian mentality or this kind of plebeian mindset had a tremendous influence on the American mindset because quite a few founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, their parents or grandparents were indentured servants, and they worked out a tenure of indentured servitude or a tenure before they became free men again. And this, I think, had a tremendous influence upon the American mindset in the colonial era. Um, Contrary to popular opinion, there really was not a sense of separation of identity from Great Britain in the 1700s. That came relatively late. Instead, the ideal was that America was New Britain. The mindset and the idea was the 13 colonies was New Britannia, it was New England and New Britain, and America would have an equal stake in the greater project of the British Empire, in this kind of new utopian New Albion, or New Britain, as it was later postulated by Enlightenment, rationalistic Enlightenment circles. Key and central to this idea and to this concept was the ideas of John Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher of the late 17th century who talked about the importance of free conscience, free thinking, and the freedom of expression and the freedom of thought. And he believed that government or government jurisprudence was based upon the consent of the governed. This was very different from that of Thomas Hobbes, who felt that an arbitrary hierarchy, a unsolicited authoritarian hierarchy, was necessary to manage and run the affairs of the state in sort of a proto-totalitarian manner. Thomas Hobbes thought that that was actually a good thing. John Locke believed in the consent, the free consent of the governed, and the goodwill of man, and the importance of the centralization of man in the grand scheme of things. And so this Lockean philosophy and this philosophy of the free commonwealth and free consent and the free commonwealth, or the commonwealth of the free man on the land, and all of this was overall very central to colonial American thinking before the Revolution. But even at that extreme, and even as the colonial assemblies believed that they had the right to declare the rights of navigation and trade with other countries outside the British Empire, and even as the colonial assemblies believed that they had the right to tax themselves, to largely govern themselves under the benevolence of Parliament and the King, there was still this notion that the 13 colonies were part of Greater Britain. They were part of the greater British project of imperialism, and innately, the origin of white Protestant American identity was inadvertently tied down to the development and the maintenance of this early phase of the British Empire. Now, there is a book, it's called The Four Seeds of Albion. The Four Seeds of Albion, and it discusses a lot of the same stuff that I talked about today, in the sense that these different groups from the British Isles and from Europe had an impact on a region in the colonies and then overall in the larger makeup of American identity. American identity was drawn out of these seeds. There was a Calvinistic Puritan seed from the east of England. There was a Carolinian gentry seed from the West Country and the Bahamas and Barbados. And there was a seed from the Quakers in northern England and Wales. There was a seed from the Presbyterian Lowland Scots in Ulster. And what you see, and what I think of what really is the origins of American identity, is competing modes of British thinking. Before the British Isles really had a unified identity, they had different regional identities. And these different regional identities, when they came to the Americas and they set up their own respective region or respective colony, that regional identity of the Old World had a direct impact on the colonial region that it was set up into. And so in this sense, there was actually four British pathways, or four British and other Western European mindsets and influences that came into the 13 colonies. This is why the North and the South are so different in many respects. This is why there are different nuances and variations in Appalachia, even between Upper and Lower Appalachia. This is why there are differences in New England as opposed to Virginia, as opposed to New York. Why there's differences in, say, Delaware and New York or Pennsylvania. Why there are differences in New Jersey. It has to do with the way that these different groups from different parts of the British Isles set up and engaged in their imperialistic projects in the colonies. And it is very well connected. Religion and Christianity also had a major impact in the early American experience. Religion has always been a very big fountain point of American identity, and religion has always been a very strong driving force in the American experience, with different competing churches, different competing Protestant bodies vying for authority, vying for legitimacy, and competing in these awakenings and stuff. That has also had a big impact as well. The warfare with the Native Americans and the slave uprisings or the slave revolts embellished into the colonial mindset a sense of racial separateness. I don't mean to say this in a prejudiced way, but it is definitely true that this sense of a almost racial setup or a racialized separateness also had an early impact. And indeed, it was ultimately the notion of religion and the notion of race that really surpassed the ethnic and regional distinctions and more religious distinctions in the early colonial experience. So This is really the origins of the American project. The American project is drawn out from these different nuanced experiences. Enslaved blacks were also very central in the early American project. There are lots of African influences in American music, in American food and cuisine. Um, Free people of color and enslaved Africans contributed greatly to the development of early America. There are lots of Southern and American dishes, American foods, and American mannerisms and focal lingualisms and religious points that are of African origin. The banjo is from Africa. Many types of musical instruments are from Africa. And rock and roll and jazz was greatly influenced by African American music and also by Celtic music. Both the Celts and the African Americans had a very tremendous impact upon America and how the American mindset was set up in the long run. So, from a dialectical and a philosophical standpoint, if you go back to the start of the colonial period, you're basically in the Tudor period. You're basically at the point of the English Renaissance and the influence of the Renaissance and the thinking and influences drawn out of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. And then when you go to the late colonial period, you see more of the early Enlightenment and the influences of rationalism and the deism of the Enlightenment, and kind of this influence of the Scottish and the French Enlightenment seeping into the American colonies, and the beginning and stirrings of the revolution, of the revolutionary current, and rejection of the old world for the new world model society that 170 something years of the colonial experience had inadvertently created. The British did not plan to build a republic. The British were trying to make wealth. They were trying to extrapolate wealth and finished products or raw products out of the American colonies and the West Indies, and they were trying to make a profit, as were the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the Swedes, and any other of those groups, and the Portuguese. They were not trying to create a utopian separatist society completely built and modeled upon a new moral ethic. As far as they were concerned, that was their territory, it was their property. The people living there were their subjects, and they were paying taxes and extrapolating resources to the mother country, or to the mother country. And therefore, the colonial period was one of a gradual waning of this concept of a connection to the mother country. Unlike Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and other such groups, Americans never really thought of themselves or really molded themselves into the mindset that they were truly a part of the greater British project. Americans, with their institutions of learning and philosophy, never ever considered themselves, except maybe in the early colonial period, to really just be expatriated subjects of the crown. By the 1700s, you can definitely say that there was a separate American identity. And indeed, it was in the 1730s and the 1740s that Yankee, or Yankee, which is basically kind of a pun, or really if not an insult, a pun of an upright American, a kind of uptight, uppity American who was considered to be rather uptight, impatient, sometimes a bit ludicrous in the mindset of the British aristocrat. And this is kind of the origin of Yankee. A Yankee was someone from New England who engaged in cheese making or some type of farming practice and business making and trade stuff. They were considered to be uptight, very tight, financially tight, covetous, religiously intolerant, upright, and very moral guiding and kind of Calvinistic. And this is how the English essentially viewed Yankees. Perhaps this is how other colonial Americans saw Yankees as well, but this is a clear example of a separating and emerging American identity in the late colonial period. And it is actually the wars with France, the wars between Great Britain and France, the Kingdom of France, which I really think do the most to really solidify the case for American separation. All throughout the 1680s and the 1690s, and again in the early 1700s in the reign of Queen Anne, and again in the 1740s when trade was very tightly blockaded. Tariffs were put into place by the British against Boston and the colonies. Very tight tariffs against trade with other countries was upheld and tightened. And there was also a bit of a depression. The South Sea Bubble was probably the first major depression in American history. And a lot of American traders were basically broken. I don't think they could file for bankruptcy, but a lot of pound sterling was lost. A lot of pounds were lost in the markets because of the South Sea Bubble. And then there was also complaints, even back then, about taxation and the issues with tariffs and embargoes against other countries, and how basically for American traders, especially those that went to the West Indies to engage in trade, the so-called transatlantic trade, the triangular trade, and how it basically broke American businessmen. Basically, what was happening was the British merchants and British traders were basically treated better than American traders and American businessmen. American businessmen were always basically outcasted, did not get a equal share as much. They did not make an equal profit earning as much as a British tradesman did. And this really pissed off the Boston merchant elite, or the Boston merchants. They really did not like that. They really did not like this second-handed treatment by London and Bristol merchants and Liverpool merchants and merchants in like Ireland and the West Indies. And so over time, the New England merchants and to a lesser degree, the Virginia and Carolina planters and the New York tradesmen began to really resent having to go directly to London to invest in their earnings. And they wanted to have local banks. They wanted to set up a local colonial currency and local banks. When they were not allowed to do that, actually for a while during the French and Indian War, they were allowed to do that. This is where you get Benjamin Franklin setting up the Albany Plan of Union in 1754. The Albany Plan of Union was to basically unite all of the 13 states into a colonial or a continental congress that was modeled after the Roman Republic. And while they would recognize the authority of the king and the authority of parliament over them, they would try to judge and rule and pass laws and provisions that favored themselves, and they would vote. The landholding gentry would vote on their senators, their delegates, and delegations, and this ultimately, the Albany Plan of Union was rejected. There had been several types. There had been a few other colonial projects to set up, like this, a type of Congress or a type of Senate to give local representation or more vouched representation. But Westminster rejected it each and every time. And once George II died and George III came into power, he would not want to reconcile or mediate in any kind of way. His prime minister, Lord North, was even less conciliatory. And so, after the end of the French and Indian Wars, which I would say is what really united the colonies together and really got them to have more of a avowed self-identity, harsher penalties were put into place. Greater penalties and harsher jurisdiction were put into place. This is when the Tea Act, the tea tax, the stamp tax, the Intolerable Acts, and other things began to be put into place. And gradually, more and more, year by year, act by act, the Americans became more and more fed up with the way that the British would practice their unjust, what they regarded as unjust and unfair measures against the exercise of the colonies in the means of controlling their own administration. The taxes themselves were not really that high. In fact, when the U.S. federal government began to install a whiskey tax in the 1790s, it was actually a higher interest than anything that Parliament ever passed. It was just, at best, a 2% interest rate. But the colonies wanted to govern themselves, at least under the rule of London, and this just wasn't going to work in the end. Whether or not something could have been resolved, some kind of measure or some kind of thing could have been done to resolve the matter, it never did. Nothing came out of it. And regardless, the principles of Lockean philosophy and the philosophies of Rousseau and Diderot and Voltaire were seeping into the thinking of the American elites. And the American elites were greatly influenced by the classicism of ancient Rome, and they really liked the Roman Republic. And in 1776, the same year that the Declaration of Independence was written, Edward Gibbon published a book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Edward Gibbon wrote a multi-volume work called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And probably every founding father read that work, and they came to decide that the Roman Empire fell because it was decadent and because it was corrupt. The Roman Republic was more pure. It was more stoic and just. And this idea of idealist Roman stoicism fed into the minds the idea of government by the consent of the people, if not necessarily the majority, really did fan into the minds of the American founding fathers. Um, in the Four Folkways of Albion Seed, in the book Albion Seed, The Four Folkways of America, or the Founding of America, a so-called fifth way of life, or a fifth British lifestyle that actually started in Oxford. It originated with the Oxford academic movement, and it developed into the bedrock of British imperialism and the British Empire, and it completely engulfed the entire British academia, was the notion of creating this British Empire. This originated out of Oxford. It was an intellectual mindset that basically took the British aristocracy by storm. And in Albion Seed, it said that American colonial elites were never subjected to this Oxford imperial movement, or this kind of greater Oxford imperial movement that really took root in Britain and was successfully, much more successfully expanded and planted into Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. But while it took root in those countries, it never took root in the United States. Nowhere in the United States did this Oxford intellectual movement that favored the expansion of empire ever really take root in the United States. This is what separates the United States from the Commonwealths of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They successfully had this mindset of a Westminster parliamentarian ideal, of a proper limited government ideal implanted there, but it never took off in the colonies. And the reason why was because the colonies were founded in the late post-Renaissance and the period of the religious wars, where all of these different competing Protestant sects were competing for authority. And what this did, this is especially true during the First Great Awakening, is it basically prevented any single power or jurisdiction taking over and establishing a long-time authority over all of the colonies. And instead, what this did was it allowed for free competition, a sort of free market competition of ideas and mindset that basically became the underlying principles of the American founding. So I think that is the colonial experience explained and exercised very well. It came from Europe. There is no doubt that it originated in Europe and the classical ideas of Greece and Rome. There is no doubt of that. There is no doubt that American thinking and American correspondence came out of the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance. And there is little to no doubt that American English is a branch of British English. And while there was not a unifying or an underlying unified method of British imperialism in the Americas in the 18th century, America was a product of British and European imperialism. It was very much a product of imperialism and colonial settler imperialism. There is no doubt whatsoever about that. There is no doubt that racism and religious fanaticism and misogyny was very much molded into the early American experiment. Just as much as the egalitarian mindset or the egalitarian principles of free religious consciousness in the Lockean mindset were also interpolated into the early American identity. So, how would I give an explanation of an underlying dialectic to the colonial experience? I would say that the colonists felt that they were in a league with God. They had established a covenant with God through the Bible, through biblical experience, and so I would call this a paternalistic theocracy. The early American colonies were basically a paternalistic settler colonial theocracy, and that is the dialectic that I would pin it up. The colonial experience was a product of the Italian Renaissance, of the Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, and the American National Project was a product of the Enlightenment, of the Age of Reason, and it was very much built out of a religious interpretation of the Bible, of the Scriptures, and the statements and confessions of the Protestant sects of that era. So, I would say that the dialectic here is the idea of building God's country in league and covenant with God, and therefore a sort of theocratic, semi-theocratic, but also an egalitarian free mindset. So the dialectic here is the Lockean concept of the consent of the governed and the free consent of the governed versus the theocratic concept, the Calvinistic concept of the unity of the church with the state. That is the dialectic, that is the major dialectic of this historical period. I have been your host, Imperator of Forge. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Faultlines of American History, case study number 2, the colonial experience. The fault lines that would later come out of the United States, the failures as well as the successes of American identity and American nationalism were drawn out of these early years, these early decades of colonial settlement, covenanter seeking or covenanter seeking of God, and consent of free government and consent or Lockean mindset and concepts. Thank you for watching and have a great day.